Ladies and gentlemen, from one extreme to another, joining us on the hottest place on earth, I give you Ben Saunders.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So my name's Ben. As you've just heard, I'm normally introduced as a polar explorer, which is a really ludicrous job title. It's not one of the options that I recall my careers advisor at school ever mentioning as one of the options I should consider, for very good reason. There are only two poles to explore. There's a North Pole and a South Pole. They were both found a long, long time before I was born, more than 100 years ago. So I have basically spent the best part of my adult life, just over 20 years, getting really good at dragging heavy things around cold places, quite slowly. I've not yet discovered any new poles, and these are parts of the world, as you can probably spot, the high Arctic and Antarctica, parts of the world where there is no real estate. There's no people, nothing going on. So certainly no brokerage. So what on earth does this qualify me to talk to you about today? It's a very good question, and my hope is emphatically not that I somehow inspire you to, later on this evening, start looking on eBay for some skis and a sledge and start planning. I do not want to inspire you to do that, because as hopefully you will understand, these are really stupid things to do. But rather, my hope is that this story might be food for thought when it comes to the journeys you're all on, as individuals, as teams, as businesses. It's a story about getting things done, about going from ambition, pretty big ambition, to execution. It's about getting things done in usually quite challenging, unpredictable, fast-paced, often pretty hostile conditions. It's a story about teamwork. You've heard some of the themes already about trust, about transparency, about success, about failure, about staying motivated along the way. So my hope is that within this, that there is something of interest and of use, of value to you all. Now, the bad news is I'm standing here with a clicker about to show you some PowerPoint slides. The good news is that my PowerPoint consists entirely of my holiday snaps from just over 20 years. So there's no text, no bullet points, just some photographs. 12 big expeditions in total, about 8,000 kilometers cumulatively on foot, on skis, in the toughest environments on Earth, very high, very far north, very far south. I've spent about 2% of my life so far in places where cold enough to leave you with near-permanent frozen eyebrows and a near-permanent sort of frozen snot, icicles dripping out of your face the poles are weird places. If you spin a globe, it rotates on the two geographic poles. If you saw Top Gear drive to the North Pole, you were slightly misled. They went to the magnetic North Pole. That's the easy one. But in my book, the proper poles, North and South poles, were the axis of the Earth's rotation. So spin a globe, it rotates on the two poles. They're not moving anywhere. They are where all the lines of longitude, so we've created this grid, latitude and longitude around the planet, all the lines of longitude converge at each pole. So if you're standing at the North Pole, every direction is south. If you're standing at the South Pole, every direction is north. And even more confusingly, all of the time zones converge, come together at both poles. So if you're standing at either pole, it can be any time you like. It's every time at the same time, if that makes any sense at all. And if you were crazy enough to spend an entire year at either pole, North or South Pole, you would notice that the sun only rises and sets once a year. So in winter, 24-hour darkness. In summer, 24-hour daylight. And the last sort of weird fact to tell you is that the North Pole is in the middle of the sea. It's in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, which is 5.4 million square miles. It's bigger than the United States. So if you are daft enough to think that walking there sounds like an interesting thing to attempt, you'll find that there are no maps because you have to travel over the frozen or semi-frozen surface of the sea, the Arctic Ocean. It's also home to the polar bear, the world's largest land-based carnivore. So it doesn't have a lot to recommend it, as you can tell. Now, I'm going to talk to you today about one journey in particular. It was down here. Hopefully you'll recognize, this is Antarctica. This is a wonderful composite satellite image of an extraordinary place. Now, unlike the North Pole, the South Pole is in the middle of land. And in fact, there is actually a dot. That's the South Pole there. It's in the middle of a really big bit of land. Antarctica is a continent. It's the size of China and India put together. Really big place. Coldest place on Earth, minus 88 degrees centigrade in winter. Driest place on Earth. It has less precipitation than Africa. It's a desert, technically. Windiest place on Earth. Wind speeds of more than 300 kilometers per hour in the winter. What else? Highest altitude constant on Earth. Most of this big plateau, the Antarctic ice cap in the middle, averages more than 2,500 meters above sea level. So it's a land of extremes. And starting in October 2013, finishing in February 2014, my teammate, a friend with a great name, he's called Tarka Lepinière. He's half French, hence the funny name. Tarka and I very simply walked from the bottom of this red line, from the sea, from the sort of New Zealand side of the continent, to the South Pole, where we turned around and walked all the way back to the coast again. That might give you an idea of scale. The total round trip, well, interestingly, the number in the video was 1,795 miles. If you learn nothing else from me today, you might remember this, because I didn't know this. I had an email from a friend who's a scientist. His sphere of expertise is sort of satellites and GPS and mapping and tracking. And he said, Ben, you realize that number is almost undoubtedly wrong. I said, what do you mean? That's from my GPS, like, doesn't get any more accurate, surely. He said, well, GPS, apparently, GPS assumes the Earth is a perfect sphere, which it's not. It's apparently a bit squished at the top and the bottom. So he reckoned, I was very pleased to hear this, he reckoned we'd actually walked 6 miles further. So 1,801 miles, which is it's nearly 70 consecutive marathons. Except, as you saw in the video at the start, we were not running marathons. We were traveling on skis, each of us wearing a harness, dragging everything we needed for nearly 4 months, because there are no shops in Antarctica. There's nothing, no cafes, there's nothing going on at all. So we're dragging all the food that we need for nearly 4 months. We're dragging fuel so that we can, for a stove, so we can melt snow to get drinking water. So at the start line, we were pulling 200 kilos each. So this was roughly the same as dragging 2 fairly large men in a bathtub, behind you on a bit of rope each, for nearly 70 consecutive marathons in the coldest, windiest, driest, highest altitude place on Earth. So it is perhaps unsurprising that this had not been done before. No one was quite stupid enough. Best summed up, I think, by this Malaysian edition of Business Insider magazine. 2 explorers just completed a polar expedition that killed everyone the last time it was attempted. Now, my mum wasn't that happy about the plan. This was my 11th expedition, so I wasn't a rank amateur. This is what I did professionally, I prided myself on being pretty good at my job, but the precedent did not look great. Of the 9 people in history who'd attempted to walk from the coast of Antarctica to the South Pole back to the coast again, no one had made it, and 5 had died in the process. And the last attempt was led by this guy, Captain Scott, Robert Falcon Scott, Scott of the Antarctic. If you haven't heard of Scott, you might have heard of his contemporary, his rival, Sir Ernest Shackleton. Scott and Shackleton were 2 sort of pioneers of this Edwardian golden age of exploration, just over a century ago. And their journeys, between them, they spent just over a decade battling away, bashing away, trying to become the first to reach the South Pole. And these journeys, I think, had a surprising amount in common with perhaps the idea of people flying to Mars within our lifetimes. Every expedition back then was 3 years at a time because aircraft didn't exist. They had to sail to Antarctica. Furthermore, at that point, just over a century ago, people had better maps of the moon than they did of Antarctica because they could see the moon through telescopes. Antarctica, no one knew what was in the middle. Over decades, multiple expeditions had sort of gradually mapped and charted the coastline, but no one knew what was in the middle. Someone thought there might be another ocean. Someone else thought there might be a hole that extended to the center of the Earth. So these were journeys into the unknown, certainly early on. And Scott's last expedition set sail from the UK in 1910, got to Antarctica the next year. Now, I mentioned this sort of 24-hour daylight in the summer, 24-hour darkness in the winter. So they arrived late summer. They had to build a hut where they could spend the winter in this wooden hut. So there is a little bit of real estate down there, I guess. They spent the winter in this hut, and then the next year got up to travel to the South Pole. Huge team using ponies, using a few dogs, using tractors, and lots of people dragging tons of supplies, positioning this sort of supply chain of depots stretching out to the South Pole. Scott's final team of 5 were traveling on foot, arrived at the South Pole January 1912 to find, to their horror, that they had been beaten to it. There was a flag already flying at the South Pole. Now, some of you might know the story. It's black and white, so you can't tell, but on the far left, as you look at this, is a Norwegian flag. Scott and his team had been beaten by a matter of weeks by a Norwegian team led by Roald Amundsen. Have we got any Norwegians in the team, in the room that I'm possibly offending? So Amundsen, of course, brilliantly beat Scott to it. Now, the crucial difference here is that the Norwegians used dogs and dog sleds with pretty brutal efficiency. So Amundsen and his men started with 53 dogs and finished with 11. They were shooting dogs en route and feeding dogs to the other dogs. There's some debate about whether they might have eaten dog meat themselves, who knows. And they executed this perfectly, first to reach the South Pole. In fact, they not only did they leave a flag, but they left this tent. That's a Norwegian tent in the background. Inside the tent was a biscuit tin. Inside the tin was a letter to King Haakon of Norway, basically saying, like, we got here first. So the Brits, pretty pissed off, as you can tell, pretty demoralized, pretty bitter, turned around, started walking 900 miles back to the coast, back to the leaky ship that would take them home eventually, a year later. None of them survived. All 5 of these people died on the returning leg of that journey in 1912. The last 3 to die, including Captain Scott, who is second from the left as you look at this with the goggles on his head. The last 3 to die had covered nearly 1,600 miles on foot in the toughest conditions on Earth. And that's a record that stood until 2014, when Tak and I finished our very long walk in Antarctica. So to me, for years, it seemed extraordinary that the high watermark of sheer human endeavor, endurance, the toughest, the ultimate sort of ultra marathon, that bar had been set so high in 1912 that no one had surpassed it. So crucially, the Norwegians were using dog sleds. They were riding on the sleds, cracking the whip. Scott's team were traveling on foot, a bit like you saw Taka in the video. So no one had gone further than this. To me, it was as if the marathon record or the Ironman triathlon record had been set in 1912. By someone, smoking a pipe and, wearing a sort of woolen sweater, tweed jacket and leather boots. And despite a century's worth of innovation and knowledge and advance, no one had raised that bar. No one had finished this journey. Why was that? Because these people, by our standards, were woefully ill-equipped, ill-clothed, ill-prepared, ill-trained. You can just about see that they don't have zips on their jackets because zips hadn't been invented yet. They didn't have vacuum flasks, thermos flasks to keep hot drinks warm during the day because they hadn't been invented yet, let alone the raft of advantages that I enjoy. Aircraft. I can fly to Antarctica these days. Synthetic materials, zips, thermos flasks, GPS, satellite phones, freeze-dried food, vitamin pills, protein shakes, all these incredible advantages. My sledge 10 years ago, and Antarctica's, they were custom made by a guy in Norway who used to work in Formula One. They're made of carbon fiber and Kevlar, each tailored. The runners underneath are Delrin, this ultra-low friction polymer, and they're matched to the exact width of our ski tracks. So Tarka's sledge is marginally different to mine to maximize efficiency. So how come with all of these advantages, no one had finished this journey? No one had gone further than these guys had. So that was a big part of the motivation, and off we went. Now, some people said, Ben, why don't you do it properly? Why don't you wear the same clothes that Shackleton and Scott did and don't take a GPS or a satellite phone? I didn't think about that for long, partly because if you look at Scott or Shackleton or Amundsen or Nansen, they were using the best technology they could get their hands on. So I was fine with using 21st century tech, and that meant that we could attempt this journey in a way that would have been unthinkable to Scott or Shackleton or Amundsen, which is two of us dragging everything. No dogs, no support team, 200 kilos each. Similar strategy, burying a series. So we left 10 depots, 10 sort of caches of food and fuel on our outward journey to pick up on the way back. And we started from exactly the same place. Here's the one bit of real estate. This is Captain Scott's hut, the wooden hut that they built in 1911, still standing. We had about 20 minutes inside it to look around. This is the only photo. It's not much of a tour, I'm afraid. But it's extraordinary, deep frozen. So it looks and feels like Captain Scott and his men left a few minutes ago. The table's still laid. There's a kettle on the stove. This is Scott's bed. That's a sleeping bag made of reindeer skin. There's a pair of socks hanging up. Someone spotted, I didn't realize it at the time, but someone spotted there's a case of champagne under the, we didn't realize that. But this was an extraordinary few, we had 20 minutes inside the hut. And on the one hand, it felt deeply special. This is a place that had inspired me, a story that had inspired me since I was a kid. And suddenly here I was. It was like I'd been beamed into the pages of I don't know, like Lord of the Rings or something. Suddenly I'm here. Like it just felt utterly surreal. And on the other hand, it was terrifying. Now, I often worry that people might assume that some screw has come so far loose in my head that I don't experience fear or self-doubt or uncertainty. That is not the case at all. At this moment, I was terrified. And I think experiencing the ultimate bout of imposter syndrome. I remember thinking, hang on a minute, Ben, this is the journey that defeated Sir Ernest Shackleton, killed Scott of the Antarctic. No one else has attempted this. None of the contemporary greats have tried this in a century. What the hell am I doing here? I've had several years of well-qualified experts telling me this is impossible. These are the reasons no one has done this. It can't be done. What am I doing here? So I was not feeling, I don't know, kind of in the zone and pumped. I was terrified. And off we went. Now, if you've seen anything on TV about Antarctica, I think you might have been slightly misled. You'd be forgiven for thinking that it's overrun with cute, fluffy penguins, which is not the case. There are some penguins. They live on the coast where it's warmest and there's food from the sea. Once you get inland, nothing can live. Giant white desert, nothing going on. We started our journey by walking in a straight line across an area called the Ross Ice Shelf, which is about the same size as France or California, very roughly, except unlike France or California, there's nothing going on at all. No hills, no valleys, no cafes and vineyards and towns, nothing going on. So we walked in a straight line on a compass bearing for 28 days and saw nothing at all. We would finish each day 8, 9, 10 hours after we started at a place that looked exactly the same as where we started from, having seen nothing at all during the course of the day. This was actually good training for married life during lockdown in the UK, it turned out. And that's when the weather's good. When the weather wasn't good, we couldn't see a thing. We had many days of complete whiteout, zero visibility. So mentally, it became as tough as it was physically. And there was a strange paradox, which is that Tarka and I spent nearly 4 months in the biggest wilderness on Earth. We didn't see anyone else. We saw nothing man-made, apart from, spoiler alert, apart from the South Pole. Other than that, nothing. We saw no vehicles, no aircraft, no building, nothing at all, no other people. And yet we were living in a space that it would be illegal to keep prisoners in. This tent was our home for 108 nights, and if I tell you that we did not wash in 108 days, we didn't have a shower or a bath, obviously. If I tell you we changed our underwear 3 times in 3.5 months, now that's purely because we want to keep the weight of the sledge as light as we possibly can. So underwear is a luxury, obviously. So we changed our underwear 3 times. We're doing between 8 and 10 hours of exercise every day, 7 days a week. We're sleeping that far away from each other at night, sharing a pee bottle in the tent. You'll understand when I say we learned a few things about transparency and trust and teamwork and human dynamics under pressure. Now, there isn't a photo of the pee bottle, don't worry, but this is the tent. That's my sleeping bag. That's Tarka getting into his. We couldn't escape from each other. Now, we were good friends at the start of this journey. We'd known each other 10 years. We are good friends now, which I think is my proudest achievement. I mean, I'm prouder of that than the world records. We came to this with enormous trust and faith in each other as individuals, as people who were very good at this stuff. We were at the top of a difficult game. But we also came to this individually with first-hand experience of small teams falling apart under this sort of pressure. And in our case, we had the self-imposed pressure of a particularly ambitious goal. We were trying to do something no one had done before. We're trying to raise the bar in a pretty demanding field. We're trying to achieve something a lot of experts thought could not be done. And secondly, we're trying to do that in an environment where almost all of the crucial variables are outside our control. Now, for us, it was literally the environment. It's the temperature, the wind direction, wind speed, visibility, the surface, nothing we can do about any of those things. And yet, at times, they were infuriating, at times, they were terrifying, and always, they had a crucial bearing on our chances of success, sometimes chances of survival. So, a lot of stress, a lot of pressure. And we worked with a really good psychologist for a few months before the start of this expedition. And the strategy she came up with was brilliant. And this really talks to transparency and trust as a theme. Basically, we wanted to avoid punching each other if we could. We knew that we had to perform every moment as effectively as we could as a team. And the best way to explain the strategy she helped us come up with is with a sort of analogy. Tarka and I understood that when it came to our equipment, our clothing, our gear, if something wasn't quite right, if the tent had a little tear in the fabric or the stitching on the seam of a jacket was coming undone or a zip wasn't working, if something wasn't quite right, if we didn't stop and fix it straight away, small things would unravel very quickly indeed and become consequential issues. And it was very easy under this sort of pressure to think, I can't be bothered, I'll fix it tomorrow, I'll deal with it next week. It'll be fine. It'll last until the end of the trip. I can't. It'll be right. If we ignored it, small things would unravel, and we had to apply the same thinking to our relationship as a team, and not just as a tiny team of 2, because we were in many ways like the ultimate remote workers. We had a team of 12 working full time in the background as our sort of mission control. Most of them in the UK, which at times was more than 10,000 kilometers away. So we're thousands kilometers away from our support team, and yet having to trust them on a daily basis with our lives, with the decisions they're making, the information they're processing. So some challenging conditions indeed. I was a bit worried. Our screensavers come out. I've got a Labrador on this one, and thankfully not there yet. Right, where am I going? Oh, one more point on transparency. I sometimes worry that people might assume that my message is purely sort of old-fashioned tough guy, Mr. Motivator. Like, come on, you wimps! You think your lives are hard and your careers are. What you do is check out how nearly dead I got in Antarctic. Check out how cold it was and heavy and try harder. Now, that's not really the point here. Yes, these journeys took a degree of grit, determination, a pretty good work ethic, all that stuff, but when I think consistently of the hardest, toughest, scariest, bravest thing Tarka and I had to do on a daily basis, it was working out how to ask each other for help. Now, part of that might be because we're English, or Tarka's half English, and therefore there's probably some genetic inability to express anything to do with emotions, genuinely. Part of it might be because we're men, and we're men who did this stuff professionally. prided ourselves on being at the top of this game, prided ourselves on being damn good at what we did, which was a pretty hard thing to be doing. And certainly for me, prided myself on my initiative, prided myself on my self-reliance, my ability to get it done no matter what anyone else said or thought. I backed myself 100%. Now that stubborn, persistent self-belief was a very useful trait, and I suspect many of you in this room have the same trait. But it sometimes got in the way of the self-evident truth that the whole point of having a team is you help each other. You have a common shared objective. So I hope that makes some sense. I'm going to rattle through these. Lots of cool tech, Intel responser, pretty low tech as well. This is Tarka sat on his sledge, clutching a 1965 US Geological Survey of a chart of an area called the Beardmore Glacier, or Glacier, tomato, tomato. I'm going to go with Glacier, the American version, I prefer that. Beardmore Glacier. The Beardmore Glacier is the largest valley glacier on planet Earth. Very few people have ever been there, so we didn't have much data to go on. In fact, Tarka and I are the only living people on planet Earth who've been all the way up it and all the way back down it again, which both Scott and Shackleton did. So, thank you. I think it says more about our stupidity than anything else, but it was, you'll notice the scenery, finally. Like we crossed this huge ice shelf, hit the mountains, had to go up this long valley. It took us from effectively sea level to 2,500 meters above sea level, 7 days of climbing this thing through it was stunning. There's no snow, it's too windy, so you have this polished surface called blue ice. We couldn't use skis, we had to use crampons, these spikes on our boots. There's no friction because there's no snow, so the sledge just rattled along. So in many ways it was wonderful, except one, which is that it's covered, like most big glaciers, in crevasses, these deep cracks in the ice. There's a couple of little mini ones under Tarka's hand there, but the biggest ones were nearly as wide as a stage, several stories deep, so we did not want to fall in a hole. Popped out at the top 7 days later, and there's a recurring theme here, flat, white, featureless for another 3 weeks until we finally arrived at the South Pole, halfway. Now, Captain Scott wrote in his diary in 1912, when they arrived at the South Pole, "Great God, this is an awful place." I don't know why we didn't pay more attention to that, but similar sort of feeling for us, for very different reasons. Nowadays, there is a massive US-run research station, in fact, with a huge junkyard on the right-hand side. Very tempting place to quit. They've got at least 2 cafes, 300 people there in December when we arrived, 300 people based there, 2 cafes, a tourist shop, a post office, a basketball court that doubles as a movie theater. So very tempting place to quit. So we decided we wouldn't set foot, even though we were invited in by the US government, the National Science Foundation, we decided we wouldn't stop because it would just be too tempting just to call it a day. So we turned around at the pole, took a photograph, after about 5 minutes, started walking back to the coast. And this is where things got really miserable. The weather turned bad. We realized we weren't going to get to the first depot, or the last depot we laid, before we ran out of food. So we halved the remaining rations that we had for 8 days. So we're normally eating 6,000 calories a day down there. Suddenly we're eating 3,000 calories a day. That was an effective weight loss plan. That's Tarka looking skinny in the tent. It's a special occasion because he's changing his underwear, obviously. I was in a similar state. By the end of the journey, I had lost 22 kilos. Tarka had lost 25 kilos. So there's a huge sort of metabolic turnover. And a difficult journey indeed. One of the hardest things for me these days is to try to put this place and this experience into words. My vocabulary doesn't come close to say it was difficult or scary or cold or just I don't have the words. One of my favorite ways of giving us some context, this place, is a number. And it's the amount of glacial ice, freshwater ice in Antarctica. And we know this from 20 odd years of satellite data quite accurately. The number is 26.5 million gigatons. A gigaton is a billion metric tons, so it's 26.5 million billion tons. That's quite a lot of tons. I drag sledges for a living, not very good at maths. So how do I get my head around this number? I remember thinking a few years back, okay, right, how many human beings are alive on Earth right now? Right, 8 billion. Okay, what if I divide this number? If all this ice were sort of allocated equally, what would our individual share be? Would it be a cube, like 15 kilos? What's your way of picturing this? The answer, and I've checked this with people that are very good at maths, the answer is 3 million tons of glacial ice in Antarctica for every one of us. Every single human being alive on Earth. 3 million tons of ice. Now, I know a bit about ice, but I don't know what 3 million tons looks like. Someone said to me on Zoom a few years ago during lockdown, oh, easy, that's about 35, 40 aircraft carriers. Big American ones. 35 to 40 aircraft carriers. A lot of ice. It's a big place. This is near the bottom of the Beardmore Glacier. We found some of the biggest crevasses had been covered in fresh snow, which was good news because it meant we had these things, snow bridges, we could get over them. Pretty scary, pretty sketchy conditions. Finally, crossed the last one, back onto the Ross ice shelf, relatively safe. All we had to do to finish was walk diagonally across this piece of ice the size of France for the second time. We knew that Scott and his team had died somewhere close to the bottom of the glacier. We knew that beyond that, we were in uncharted territory. No one had walked this far before in these conditions. And I was secretly hoping that nearly 4 months in the middle of nowhere with no email, no social media, no other people, no gossip, no idea what was happening in the news, blank white nothingness, just to meditate for 12 hours a day, that I might access some enlightened level of consciousness. I'm sad to report that did not really happen. All I can remember for the last 2 weeks of this journey was a recurring daydream that would torture me, and it was a first-person video of me walking into, in my head, of me walking into a restaurant. And it's a real place. It's called Lomitos. It's in the southern tip of Chile, a town called Punta Arenas. I knew we'd be landing in Punta on our long journey back home. So a very real chance this could happen. And Lomitos is basically a very cheap, very greasy Chilean burger restaurant. So for hours, if not days, if not 2 whole weeks of my life so far, all I can remember thinking about was cheeseburgers. So maybe that is the meaning of life. And then finally, 108 days after we started, we reached this pretty unsexy-looking finish line. And there is definitely a finish line. There's a crack between the ice. The sledges are still on the ice, Tark and I on the land. The people in black and orange are scientists from New Zealand. They have a base just along the coast. They came to clap us over the line. And without doubt, the biggest anti-climax of my entire life. I remember making sure that Tarka was next to me as we got close to this crack. We took our skis off, stepped across at the same time, boots onto the land. We'd done it. Longest ever human-powered polar journey in history. First ever return journey to the South Pole on foot. Finished the journey that defeated Shackleton, killed Scott, achieved the most audacious goal I could have set. Dream come true. Nothing happened. There was no sort of lightning bolt, kind of no immediate feeling of elation or triumph or victory. And then rather than my life becoming immediately more awesome, having achieved the biggest goal I could have set, it got a lot less awesome for a long time. Now, this might sound like the most demotivational thing I could be telling you right now. Like, I set my sights as high as I could in my professional field. Experts said, this can't be done. I said, hold my beer, watch this. Worked my backside off for, by this point, 15 years, like laser focus on getting this done. Built a brilliant team, raised a load of money. These were expensive camping trips. This project alone, 2.7 million US dollars. Expensive trips, big complex things. Did it, and it didn't feel like I expected. Like, where am I going with this story? 2 things. I think firstly, if you'd asked me before this journey, Ben, how do you define success? I would have said success equals achieving your goal, obviously. If you'd asked me what my goal was, I could have given you the precise coordinates, like that's it. That is, that's the goal. And I achieved it, and I didn't know where to go next. So what does success look like to me today? I would say something like continuing to strive well. I think I'd made the mistake of thinking of success as a finish line, a threshold in the future, a one-time deal. Like, things are tough now, things are challenging now, things aren't perfect now, but when I get there, that's it. I'll have done it. And I got there in every sense of the word, and nothing really changed. Secondly, of course, in business, there is no finish line. I don't think any company is trying to get to a point where they're finished. We're stuck like, that's it. Like, take the website down, shut down the emails, lock the office forever. We're done. I don't think that's the point. Now, if you're a founder, you might be eyeing an exit, but you don't want the whole thing to fail. So success is not a finish line. I hope that makes sense. And I'm almost out of time, so I'll rattle through these. No less ambitious. I went back to Antarctica, 2017, 2018. holding up 2 fingers because I thought I was the second in history to go solo to both poles. There's a mystery Russian in the 90s, so maybe 3 of us, who knows, who cares. But this was now, in a sense, the least adventurous thing I could be doing. I'd figured that game out. So there was a pivot before COVID into logistics. That was a lot of fun, working down in Antarctica. But one quick final thought. People often ask, Ben, how did you keep going? What can you share about sort of motivation and ambition? Looking back, not just on this journey, but on 20 years, 12 big expeditions, looking back, the biggest obstacles I had to overcome were never external. They were never environmental. It was never the amount of money I had to raise or the temperature or the weight of the sledge or whatever. It was always something in my own head. It was my own fear, my own uncertainty, my own hesitation, procrastination. And I think the biggest ingredient in the professional success that I had, the biggest ingredient was self-belief. Now, I think I need to come up with a better term, because that sounds a bit like ego or arrogance or pride or self-importance. I don't mean any of those things. I do mean the belief in your own capacity, your agency, your ability to go from 0 to 1, from an idea to execution. The belief that tomorrow can be better than today, and that we as a team, as a company, have the ability to make that happen. And my theory is that self-belief is a bit like a muscle. Like, we're all born with muscles. Some people just naturally are stronger than others, but crucially, it's a human thing that we all have that responds to stimulus. If you want to make your muscles stronger, they need to be tested and challenged. You need to pick up heavy things and keep doing it. And the same is true of self-belief. In order to make it stronger, it needs to be challenged. You need to spend time on the edge of your comfort zone, taking the right amount of risk. And I often think that some people, some businesses might make the mistake of thinking, we're not going to attempt this thing, we're not going to start, we're not going to take this risk, try this new thing, until we're confident. My experience is that confidence only ever follows courage. You can't learn to swim by reading a book about swimming. At some point, you have to get into the water, and you're not going to get it right the first time, but you have to do the thing in order to become good at doing the thing. I think that holds true for any worthwhile endeavor. Now, crucially, I'm not talking about being reckless, because I genuinely spent more time in that 20-year period in spreadsheets than I did on skis. There's a huge amount of preparation and groundwork and planning that went into each expedition. But there was always a moment where I had to start, and I always felt afraid. So I hope that makes sense. Self-belief is like a muscle. You've got to stretch it and test it and use it. I think that's it. Final thought. I had, for a few years in London, fundraising, trying to get this huge project off the ground. We had a desk I had a desk in the office in Southwest London. Framed above my desk on the wall was a page from one of my school reports. I think I was 14 years old. I ought to scan this at some point. There was a line that I like. It said, Ben lacks sufficient impetus to achieve anything worthwhile. Now, in some ways, that teacher was absolutely right. Like, I'm 46 years old now. I'm still on my gap year after school. I haven't made it to university. I haven't written a resume in years. I'm utterly unemployable. But if I've learned anything in doing what I've been doing, it is that no one else is the authority on your potential. As individuals, as teams, as businesses, you're the only people who decide how far away your limits genuinely lie. And if my experience is anything to go by, with enough self-belief, enough determination, enough trust within the people around you, transparency, a good enough reason to keep going, then pretty much anything is possible. That's my story. Thank you all very much.